Cambodian Sorcery, Tom's fight to break the dark spell. The story unfolds in a haunting, remote village where dark sorcery lingers. Tom, a man burdened by personal loss, returns to his uncle's village, seeking solace but finding only terror. As he crosses the cemetery under the chilling moonlight, an eerie sense of dread takes hold. The villagers whisper of a malevolent spirit, tales of the dead returning, and unsettling cries in the night. Tom soon learns that his uncle is dabbling in sinister rituals, aiming to harness dark powers through the use of human remains. Despite his normally fearless nature, Tom is drawn into a spine-chilling journey, confronting the horrors of his uncle's twisted practices. A battle of wits and strength ensues as he grapples with the supernatural forces threatening the village. Shadows loom, and evil seems to wrap around every corner, turning familiar faces into terrifying apparitions. The story builds into a dramatic crescendo as Tom confronts the horrifying truths and fights to break the curse strangling his home. The darkness is tangible, fear pervasive, and the resolution leaves an indelible mark on all involved. Part 1. The Return. Tom walked the dusty, narrow path leading back to the village he had left behind so many years ago. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the barren fields. His heart was heavy, a dead weight lodged deep in his chest. It had been a decade since he left his place, escaping the grip of memories that now pull him back. His parents' deaths had been tragic, but losing his wife during childbirth was an unbearable blow. Seeking solace, he had wandered through his grief, drifting from one place to another, but nothing eased his pain. Now, the only place left to return was here, the village of his childhood. Yet, as he approached the outskirts, a chill ran through his veins. The familiar road had changed. The trees lining the path were twisted and gnarled, their branches stretched like skeletal fingers toward the dim sky. It was early evening, but a strange darkness cloaked the village. Tom's unease grew with every step. This was not the village he remembered. As he walked deeper into the village, he saw the cemetery old and foreboding on the right-hand side of the road. Rows of ancient tombstones jutted out of the earth, their surfaces cracked and worn by time. Tom quickened his pace, trying to ignore the prickling sensation crawling up his spine. The wind rustled through the tall grass around the graves, producing a low, eerie whistle that pierced the otherwise silent dusk. It was as if the cemetery itself was breathing, whispering secrets that were better left unheard. Tom couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He glanced around nervously, expecting to see something lurking among the tombstones. But the cemetery was empty, just floors of cold, lifeless stone. He hurried on, his boots crunching against the gravel path, eyes fixed ahead. His heart thudded in his chest, a drumbeat that matched the growing darkness around him. The village finally came into view. Its silhouette against the dying light seemed different, darker. The houses stood as silent sentinels, their windows hollow and black. Tom's skin prickled with the sensation that the village was holding its breath, waiting. Something was wrong. He could feel it in his bones, an electric hum of danger that tingled up his spine. The usual sounds of a village settling in for the evening, the laughter of children, the chatter of neighbors were eerily absent. It was like walking into a dream, one that threatened to twist into a nightmare at any moment. Tom stopped in his tracks. He had expected to feel a sense of familiarity, of homecoming, but all he felt was dread. His gaze swept over the village square, now devoid of life. A single lamplight flickered at the far end, casting a wavering glow that only deepened the shadows around it. Tom's stomach tightened. What had happened here? As he ventured further in, the uneasy silence was broken by the distant bark of a dog. A lone, disjointed howl that echoed through the village, followed by others high-pitched, frantic. It was a sound that made his blood run cold, the kind of barking that spoke of fear, of an intruder. Tom glanced around, his eyes darting from one shadow to the next. The air grew colder, thick with a tension that pressed down on him like an invisible hand. Then he noticed them, the villagers. They appeared from the shadows, silent and still. Faces emerged in the dim light, pale and haggard, eyes wide and weary. They stood in their doorways, half hidden behind sagging wooden frames, peering out at him with a mixture of curiosity and fear. Tom raised a hand in greeting, a tentative wave, but no one responded. They simply watched, their expressions hollow, as if they were expecting something or someone else. Tom, a voice called out, low and gravelly. Tom turned to see an old man shuffling toward him. It was Mr. Finch, the village elder, his eyes sunken and dark. "You've come back," he muttered, his tone carrying no hint of warmth or welcome. "Yes," "I've returned," Tom replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "But what has happened here?" "The village. It feels different." Mr. Finch glanced around warily, then took a step closer to Tom. "Things have changed," he whispered, his breath smelling of stale herbs and smoke. "There's something in this village now, something that doesn't belong. You can sense it, can't you?" Tom swallowed hard, his throat dry. Yes, he could sense it, the oppressive atmosphere, the way the village seemed to shudder in the growing darkness. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely a murmur. "A darkness," the old man replied, his gaze yet drifting toward the cemetery in the distance. "It started after the old rituals began again. But you should go. This is no place for the living after nightfall." A chill swept over Tom, freezing him in place. The old rituals? The words echoed in his mind like a death knell. His uncle had spoken of ancient practices long ago, tales of sorcery and spirits that lurked at the edges of the village. They were just stories then, folk tales to scare children. But standing here, surrounded by the ghostly silence and the haunting gazes of the villagers, Tom felt the reality of those stories pressing down on him like a leaden weight. "Where is my uncle?" he asked, his voice trembling despite his best effort to sound calm. The old man hesitated, his eyes narrowing. "Your uncle? Lives at the edge of the village now, near the woods," he muttered. He has changed, Tom, you'll see. But be careful. The village, it's not the same as you remember." Tom nodded, though his stomach churned with apprehension. The elder's cryptic warnings only added to the heavy sense of dread. He moved on, the gravel crunching beneath his feet, like the grating of bones. Each step took him closer to his uncle's house and deeper into the shadows that seemed to gather around him, thickening like a storm. The houses grew sparser, older, as he approached the outskirts of the village. The path twisted and narrowed, leading into a grove of twisted trees. Moonlight filtered through the branches, casting distorted shadows on the ground. Tom's breath grew shallow, his heart pounding against his ribs. The darkness ahead seemed alive, pulsating with a malevolent energy. There it was, the house. It stood at the edge of the woods, half hidden among the banana trees that rustled in the wind like restless spirits. The structure was old, its walls covered in creeping vines, its roof sagging under the weight of age. A single candle flickered in the window, casting a dim, wavering light that barely pierced the darkness around it. Tom approached, his steps faltering as he reached the front door. He raised a hand to knock, but paused, the air around him growing colder, heavier. He could hear the faint murmurs of chanting from inside, low and rhythmic, as if carried on a breeze from some otherworldly place. His skin crawled, every instinct screaming at him to turn back, to leave this place and never return. But he forced himself to knock, the sound echoing like a thunderclap in the silence. The chanting stopped abruptly. A moment of stillness passed, stretching on for what felt like an eternity. Then, the door creaked open. In the dim light stood his uncle, his face gaunt and shadowed, eyes gleaming with an unnatural glint. Tommy rasped, his voice carrying an edge of surprise mixed with something else, something dark and sinister. "You've come back." Tom felt a lump in his throat as he looked into his uncle's eyes. They were not the eyes he remembered, full of warmth and wisdom. No, these eyes were hollow, consumed by a darkness that chilled Tom to the core. The uncle he knew was gone, replaced by a man who had delved into things that should have been left buried. "Uncle," Tom began, his voice unsteady. "What have you been doing here?" His uncle's lips curled into a faint, twisted smile. "Come inside," Tommy said, stepping aside to let him in. "There is much to discuss." With the heart pounding in fear and uncertainty, Tom stepped across the threshold, knowing that whatever awaited inside, it would change everything he believed about the world and himself. The door creaked shut behind him, sealing him in the darkness that now wrapped around his soul. Part 2. The Haunted Village. Tom woke early the next morning, feeling a heaviness in the air that seemed to press down on his chest. The shadows of last night's encounter with his uncle still clung to his mind like cobwebs, sticky and unsettling. He had barely slept, plagued by restless dreams that dissolved into the darkness as soon as he opened his eyes. Yet, despite his exhaustion, he knew he had to venture out into the village. He needed answers. As he stepped outside, the morning sun did little to warm the chill that gripped his heart. The village was waking up, but its movements were sluggish and strained. Doors creaked open and faces peeked out cautiously, as if fearing what the new day might bring. Tom began his walk, his eyes scanning for any hint of the life and laughter he remembered from his childhood. But what he found were only wary glances and whispers that died on the wind. The villagers avoided his gaze, hurriedly closing their doors when they saw him approach. Tom felt an uneasy knot form in his stomach. What had changed this once lively place into a settlement of shadows? He caught the eye of an old woman, her face lined with years of hardship, and decided to approach. "Good morning," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm Tom. I've come back to visit my uncle." The old woman looked at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and sadness. "Tom," she muttered, her voice trembling as if speaking his name might invite misfortune. "You should not have returned. The village is not what it used to be." Why? Tom pressed gently, though he could feel his pulse quickening. "What's happened here?" She hesitated, glancing around as if expecting something or someone to leap out of the shadows. "There are things you should not ask, young man," she replied, her voice lowering to a hushed whisper. "But you will hear them soon enough. Just be careful at night with that." She turned away, shuffling back to her doorway and closing it firmly behind her. Tom stood there, heart pounding. The old woman's words sent a chill creeping up his spine. There was something lurking here, something that made even the simplest of questions seem dangerous. He continued walking through the village, the houses huddling close together as if to ward off an unseen threat. The air was thick with tension, like a storm waiting to break. A sudden rustling caught his attention. He turned to see a group of children standing by a fence, their faces pale and eyes wide with fear. They huddled close together, whispering to each other while casting furtive glances at the woods beyond the village. When they noticed Tom watching them, they froze, their whispers silenced. "Hey kids," Tom called out, trying to sound friendly. "What's going on? Why are you all so scared?" One of the older children, a boy with tangled hair and hollow cheeks, stepped forward. His eyes were wide, reflecting a maturity far beyond his years. "Mister," he said, his voice barely audible, "have you heard the howling?" Tom's blood ran cold at the question. "Howling?" he echoed, his throat tight. "What do you mean at night?" the boy continued, his gaze drifting toward the dark line of trees in the distance. "There's howling, not from wolves or dogs, but something else. It's like a scream, like someone's in pain." He shuddered, the other children nodding in silent agreement. Tom swallowed hard, a prickle of fear crawling down his spine. "And what else?" he prompted, though part of him already dreaded the answer. The boy hesitated, glancing nervously at his friends before speaking again. "Sometimes people see things," he whispered, his eyes locking onto Tom's with a piercing intensity. "Shadows that move in the night, faces at the windows when no one's there. And then, some people don't wake up in the morning." The final words hit Tom like a punch to the gut. He took a step back, struggling to maintain his composure. The idea of mysterious deaths and ghostly apparitions seemed absurd. Yet the fear in the children's eyes was real. "What do you mean they don't wake up?" he forced himself to ask. "They die," the boy replied bluntly, "in their sleep. Some say it's because they heard the howling or saw the shadows. Others just never wake up. The elders say it's a curse." A curse. The word hung in the air like a toxic fog, suffocating Tom's thoughts. He thanked the children and walked away, his mind churning with questions and fear. As he wandered through the village, he saw more signs of decay and dread. The houses seemed to lean inward, as if collapsing under the weight of something unseen. Windows were covered with rags and boards, shutting out both the daylight and whatever horrors might creep in after dark. The whispers grew louder as he passed groups of villagers. He caught fragments of conversations, snippets that made his blood run cold. The spirits. "Restless, took another last night. Cursed ground." The words painted a picture of a village living in terror, haunted by something beyond their understanding. Despite the creeping dread gnawing at his insides, Tom pressed on. He had to know more. He had to find out what was plaguing this village and what his uncle's role in it was. Finally, he came across a middle-aged man sitting on a porch, puffing on a pipe. His eyes were bloodshot, and he watched Tom approach with a mixture of suspicion and resignation. "Mind if I sit?" Tom asked, nodding to the empty space on the porch. The man shrugged, taking another long drag from his pipe. "Do what you want," he muttered. "Ain't nobody got control over anything in this cursed place no more." Tom sat down, glancing sideways at the man. "I heard people talking," he began cautiously, "about howling, shadows and deaths." The man let out a bitter laugh, smoke curling around his head like a ghostly halo. "You heard right," he said, his voice rough. "This place is damn. Used to be a good village, peaceful. But now," he trailed off, shaking his head. "Now it's haunted by what?" Tom pressed, feeling his stomach knotting tighter. The man's gaze turned steely, and he leaned closer, lowering his voice to a harsh whisper. "There's dark magic at work here," he spat, his eyes blazing with fear, anger. "People say it started with your uncle. They say he started practicing things he shouldn't have." Tom's heart skipped a beat. "His uncle? What do you mean?" he asked, his mouth dry. "What has my uncle been doing?" The man took a deep breath, exhaling slowly as he stared into the distance. "He delved into sorcery, they say," he replied grimly. "Began messing with the spirits, calling on forces that don't belong in this world. And ever since then, we've had the howling, the shadows, people dying in their sleep, their faces twisted in horror. Some say he's made a pact with something evil." Tom sat in stunned silence, the words wrapping around him like a coil of fear. He had always known his uncle to be a man of deep knowledge, one who studied ancient practices, but sorcery? The idea was almost laughable, and yet, here he was, in a village gripped by an unexplainable darkness, a village where people spoke of howls and shadows, as if they were everyday occurrences. "How do you know it's him?" Tom asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man turned to look at him, his eyes dark and hollow. "We don't," he admitted, "but who else could it be?" The howling started not long after he began his rituals, and the spirits, whatever they are, seemed drawn to his house. He paused, the weight of his words settling heavily between them. "It ain't natural, and if you're smart, you'll stay away from him." Tom nodded slowly, his thoughts a tangled mess of disbelief and fear. Could his uncle truly be involved in something so sinister? As much as he wanted to deny it, the signs were pointing in one direction. But the man's warning had stirred a spark of defiance within him. He couldn't turn his back on his family, no matter what darkness surrounded them. He stood up, his legs trembling slightly. "Thank you," he said, his voice firm despite the turmoil inside him. "But I need to find out the truth for myself," the man nodded, a flicker of pity crossing his face. "You do that," he said quietly, "but be careful. The darkness here, it doesn't let go easily." Tom walked away, the man's words echoing in his mind. He made his way back to his uncle's house, the wind picking up and rustling the leaves in an ominous whisper. As he approached the doorway, he felt a shiver of fear creep up his spine. His uncle was involved in something dark, he could feel it now, a tangible presence pressing against his consciousness. His fingers hesitated on the door handle. For the first time in his life, Tom felt a flicker of true fear. Not the fleeting fear of nightmares or ghost stories, but a deep, gut-wrenching terror that clawed at the edges of his mind. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open, stepping into the shadowed interior where his uncle awaited. Whatever was happening in this village, Tom was determined to face it. But as the door creaked shut behind him, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just crossed a threshold into a darkness from which there might be no return. Part 3. Strange Happenings. The nights in his uncle's house were long and unsettling. Tom had not been back in this room for over a decade, and while the walls, furniture, and even the old rug were the same, something intangible had changed. The house creaked in the darkness, settling into the earth like an old beast. Shadows gathered in the corners, whispering secrets he couldn't quite hear. Tom lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing with the eerie tales he had heard from the villagers. Sleep did not come easily. Every time his eyes closed, images of twisted trees, dark rituals, and his uncle's hollow gaze flashed behind his lids. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the window panes. Tom pulled the blanket tighter around himself, trying to chase away the growing chill that seeped into his bones. Howling, the children had said. Was it the wind, or was there something else out there, lurking in the dark? It was the third night since he had arrived when it happened. Tom awoke suddenly, his heart pounding in his chest. A sound had shattered his sleep, a noise so piercing that it made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He sat bolt upright, ears straining in the silence that followed. For a moment he wondered if he had dreamt it, the remnants of some nightmare clawing at his consciousness. But then it came again, slicing through the darkness, a scream. It wasn't a scream of anger or even pain, it was a howl of sheer, unearthly terror. The kind of sound that twisted the soul and froze the blood in the veins. Tom's stomach lurched. He had never heard anything like it. It reverberated through the house, rattling the old wooden beams, filling the air with a chilling resonance that made his skin crawl. For a moment, Tom couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The scream seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. He scrambled out of bed, his legs weak and unsteady. His mouth was dry, and his heart pounded so loudly that he could hear the blood rushing in his ears. What was that? The air around him felt heavy, as if pressing down on his chest, squeezing the breath from his lungs. Tom moved toward the window, each step a struggle against the fear that paralyzed him. He peered out into the darkness, but the village lay quiet and still, bathed in the faint glow of the moon. The scream had stopped, leaving behind a silence so profound it was almost as terrifying as the noise itself. Tom stood there, staring into the night, his mind a whirlpool of dread and confusion. His hands trembled as he reached for the candle on the bedside table, lighting it with shaky fingers. The flickering flame cast long, distorted shadows on the walls, and for a moment he thought he saw something move in the corner of the room. He spun around, heart in his throat, but there was nothing there, just the emptiness of the old house. His uncle's house. Swallowing hard, Tom forced himself to move toward the hallway. The house was eerily quiet, each floorboard creaking under his weight as he made his way to his uncle's room. He raised his hand to knock, hesitating as doubt clawed at him. What would he find on the other side? The thought made his stomach churn, but he steeled himself and knocked softly. There was a moment of silence, and then the door creaked open. His uncle stood there, silhouetted in the dim light, his face partially hidden in shadow. Tom couldn't read his expression. Was it annoyance, fear, or something darker? What is it? Tom, his uncle asked, his voice gravelly and flat, devoid of emotion. Did you hear it? Tom stammered, struggling to keep his voice steady. That scream. It woke me up. It sounded like he trailed off, unable to find the right words. It sounded like a nightmare given voice dog. His uncle's eyes flickered, a strange glint in them that sent a shiver down Tom's spine. Go back to bed, Tommy replied coldly. The night plays tricks on the mind. Do not let it get to you, but I heard something, Tom insisted, his fear now mixed with a rising sense of frustration. It wasn't a trick of the mind, it was real. What's happening in this village? What are you not telling me? The old man's gaze hardened, and for a moment Tom thought he saw a flash of anger, or was it fear, in his eyes. You ask too many questions, his uncle muttered, turning away. There are forces at work here that are beyond your understanding. Some things are better left alone, uncle, please. Tom pleaded, stepping forward. Are you involved in? The villagers are scared. They say there are curses, dark rituals, and they think you have something to do with it. His uncle froze, his back to Tom, the tension radiating from his hunched shoulders. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost a growl. You would do well to keep your nose out of matters that do not concern you, Tom. So he turned slowly, his eyes locking onto Tom's with a burning intensity that made his blood run cold. There are ancient practices here, rituals that call upon powers you cannot begin to fathom. Meddling in them has consequences. The finality in his tone sent a spike of fear through Tom. Consequences. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. His uncle's expression softened for a moment, a flicker of something almost like pity crossing his features. Go back to bed, he repeated quietly. Do not concern yourself with things beyond your grasp. Tom opened his mouth to argue, to demand answers, but the look in his uncle's eyes stopped him. There was a darkness there, a shadow that whispered of horrors Tom could barely imagine. With a sinking heart, he nodded and backed away, retreating to his room. His uncle closed the door without another word, the click of the latch echoing ominously in the stillness. Back in his room, Tom sank onto the bed, his mind racing. What had he stumbled into? His uncle spoke of powers and rituals as if they were as real as the air they breathed. And the scream, that scream was unlike anything natural. It was as if the very soul of the village had cried out in agony. Sleep was out of the question. Tom lay awake, staring at the ceiling as shadows danced across it in the candlelight. His uncle's words echoed in his mind. There are ancient practices here. Consequences, what did that mean? He thought of the villagers, their haunted eyes, their whispers of curses and spirits. Could it all be connected? Morning came slowly, the grey light of dawn seeping through the cracks in the shutters. Tom felt drained, his body heavy with exhaustion and his mind buzzing with questions. He rose from the bed, his limbs stiff and sore, and made his way outside. The village was already stirring, though the atmosphere was thick with unease. As he walked through the square, he caught snippets of hurried conversations. Another scream last night. Did you hear it? They say the spirits are angry or cursed, I tell you. With all cursed, Tom felt a chill run down his spine. It wasn't just him, others had heard the scream too. He approached a group of villagers, their faces pale and drawn. Did something happen last night, he asked, his voice rough with fatigue. An elderly woman looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear. The scream, she whispered, clutching a charm around her neck. It came from the old woods. They say the spirits are restless. They hunger for something. Someone is meddling with forces best left untouched. Tom's heart skipped a beat. Who he pressed, though he already feared the answer. The villagers exchanged nervous glances. Your uncle, one of them finally said, her voice trembling. He's been seen in the woods at night chanting, performing rituals. The elders warned him, but he wouldn't listen. And now, the spirits are angry. Tom staggered back, his mind reeling. His uncle. Involved in rituals? The very idea made his stomach turn. He had always known his uncle to be a man of deep knowledge and curiosity about ancient practices, but to dabble in sorcery? To invoke the wrath of the spirits? He must be stopped, another villager muttered, eyes darting toward the woods. Before more lives are claimed by this cursed, Tom felt a surge of anger and fear. He needed answers, and he needed them now. Turning on his heel, he stormed back to the house, his heart pounding with a mixture of dread and determination. This time, he would not be brushed off. His uncle knew more than he was letting on, and Tom intended to get the truth. He burst into the house, his eyes scanning the dim interior. Uncle, he shouted, his voice echoing off the walls. I need to know what's going on. No more secrets. His uncle emerged from the shadows, his face eerily calm. You will only find despair in the answers you seek, he replied, his voice unnervingly steady. Then, let me face that despair, Tom shot back, his hands shaking. But I cannot stand by while people are dying, while the village is consumed by fear. What have you done for a moment? His uncle said nothing, the silence stretching on until it threatened to snap. Then, with a heavy sigh, he spoke. I have sought knowledge, he admitted, his eyes darkening. Knowledge that has a price. There are forces in this world, Tom, forces that hunger for more than just blood. They crave the essence of life, the very soul of a place. I have dabbled in things I perhaps should not have. Tom stared at him, his mouth dry. You. Dabbled, he whispered, horror rising in his chest. You call forth these things. For what purpose, to understand, his uncle replied, his gaze distant. To wield power that lies beyond mortal grasp. But the spirits, they demand sacrifices, and once called upon, they do not easily retreat. The room seemed to darken around them, the air growing colder. Tom felt his skin crawl, his pulse quickening in fear and anger. So this is your doing, he said through gritted teeth. The screams, the deaths, it's all because of you. His uncle's expression remained impassive. Yes, he murmured. And now it cannot be undone. Tom took a shaky step back, his mind spinning. The village was under a curse, and his uncle was at the heart of it. A wave of nausea washed over him, the enormity of the situation crashing down on him like a tidal wave. What was he supposed to do now? How could he fight something so ancient, so powerful? He turned and fled the room, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He needed air. He needed to think. As he stumbled outside, the morning sun seemed harsh and unforgiving, offering no warmth or comfort. He glanced back at the house, its shadow looming over him like a silent predator. Whatever darkness his uncle had unleashed, Tom knew he would have to face it. And he was terrified. Part 4. Confronting the darkness. Tom paced back and forth in his room, his mind racing with fear and anger. It was finally clear that his uncle had something to do with the horrors plaguing the village. His hands trembled, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. The darkness had been creeping closer every night, and Tom could feel its icy fingers coiling around his sanity. But now he had to confront it. He had to confront him. The house was silent except for the creaking of the wooden floorboards under Tom's restless footsteps. The morning light outside was dim, almost choked by a thick blanket of clouds. It felt as though the village itself was holding its breath, waiting for something dreadful to happen. Tom stopped at the window, staring out at the grey sky. He knew there was no more time for hesitation. Whatever his uncle had done, Tom needed the truth, and he needed it now. Taking a deep breath, he strode down the narrow hallway toward his uncle's room. The air grew colder with every step, as if the walls themselves were warning him to turn back. But Tom's resolve hardened. This confrontation was inevitable. He reached the door, his hand hovering over the doorknob, his heart thudding painfully against his ribs. For a moment, doubt clawed at him. What if he wasn't ready to hear the truth? What if his uncle had become something inhuman? Tom pushed the thoughts aside. He had to know. He turned the doorknob and pushed the door open, the hinges groaning like a creature in pain. His uncle sat by the window, staring out into the fog-draped forest. The room was dim, shadows pooling in the corners like black ink. On the small table beside him, strange objects glinted: a bundle of dried herbs, a bowl filled with something dark and unidentifiable, and most disturbingly, a small, ancient-looking knife covered in peculiar symbols. Uncle Tom began, his voice taut, barely masking the anger bubbling beneath the surface. I need to know the truth. No more secrets, no more evasions. What have you done? His uncle did not turn around immediately. He remained motionless, his gaze fixed on the forest, as if seeking something in the endless expanse of twisted branches. Tom could feel the tension in the air, a thick, almost tangible fog that pressed down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. Finally, his uncle sighed, a long, weary sound that sent a chill down Tom's spine. He turned slowly, his eyes meeting Tom's. The look in them was unreadable, a blend of sorrow, defiance, and something far darker, a flicker of madness perhaps. You won't like what you hear, Tom, his uncle said softly, his voice hollow. Some things are not meant to be understood by those who walk in the light. Tom felt a surge of anger. The village is dying, his back, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. People are living in fear, hearing screams at night, seeing things that shouldn't exist. And they say it all started with you. What are you doing? What have you unleashed? His uncle's gaze hardened, and for a moment, Tom thought he saw a flash of something inhuman in his eyes. I sought knowledge, he replied, his tone a mixture of defiance and regret. Knowledge that has been lost for centuries. You see, this land is steeped in ancient power, a power that has slept for generations. I merely sought to awaken it. Awaken what? Tom demanded, his voice rising. What could possibly be worth all of this? The fear, the death. Silence, his uncle roared, his eyes blazing with a sudden fury that made Tom take a step back. The room seemed to darken, the shadows deepening as if responding to his anger. His uncle took a deep, shuddering breath, and when he spoke again, his voice was calmer but no less chilling. You do not understand, Tom. There are forces in this world, ancient forces, that can grant power beyond imagining, power over life, and death. Tom's blood ran cold. The room swam around him as the implications of his uncle's words settled into his mind. You're talking about dark magic, he whispered, horror twisting in his gut. You're using human remains to gain power. His uncle's eyes glinted, a twisted pride mingling with the madness lurking there. Yes, he admitted, his voice a mere whisper. The rituals I have practiced require sacrifices, bones, blood, pieces of those who once lived. It is through their remains that I tap into the ancient magic of this land. I thought I could control it, harness it for something greater. Tom staggered back, revulsion rising in his throat. You've been defiling graves, taking pieces of people. He could hardly believe what he was hearing. His uncle, the man who had raised him, who had once seemed so wise, had become a practitioner of the blackest sorcery. Why, uncle? Why would you do this? A bitter smile twisted his uncle's lips. To understand, he replied, his eyes gleaming. To see beyond the veil that separates our world from the next. The power I have glimpsed is beyond anything you can comprehend, Tom. It is terrifying, yes, but also magnificent, magnificent. Tom choked out, fury boiling within him. Is that what you call the screams at night? The shadows stalking the village? The deaths those were. Unfortunate consequences, his uncle murmured, looking away. The spirits are restless. They resist the ritual, seek to break free. But I am close to controlling them. Once I have completed the final rite, they will be mine to command. Tom stared at him in disbelief. You've cursed this village, he said, his voice trembling with rage and fear. People are dying because of your greed for power. You have unleashed something that you cannot control. His uncle's face twisted, and for the first time, Tom saw the full depth of his uncle's madness. You do not understand, he hissed, his voice dropping to a low, venomous whisper. I must finish what I started. The power I seek is not for myself alone, it is for all of us. This village, this land, it will become a place of greatness, greatness, Tom shouted, the word echoing through the room. You brought nothing but horror and death. Look at what you've become, a monster. You're playing with forces you don't understand, and now you've damned us all. His uncle's eyes burned with a fervor that made Tom's blood run cold. You speak of damnation, yet you know nothing, he retorted. This world is already damned, Tom. It is ruled by forces that laugh at our suffering. I am merely seeking to turn those forces to our benefit. At what cost? Tom yelled, his voice raw with fury. The lives of innocent people, their souls, you've damned them for the sake of your ambition. His uncle's lips curled into a sneer. the weak perish so that the strong may thrive. This is the way of the world, the truth of all power." He turned back to the window, his eyes glazing over as he gazed into the forest. "You are naive, Tom. The darkness does not care for morality or innocence. It only understands strength." Tom felt a wave of nausea. This was not his uncle speaking, it was something twisted, corrupted by the darkness he had embraced. "Then I will stop you," Tom declared, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at him. "I won't let you finish whatever it is you're planning. I will end this curse." His uncle laughed, a harsh, grating sound that filled the room. "You," he mocked, turning to face Tom. "You, who have no understanding of the power at work here. You cannot stop what has already been set in motion. The final rite is coming, and when it is completed, not even death itself will dare to defy me." Tom's fists clenched at his sides. He was terrified, yes, but that terror was fueling his determination. "I will find a way," he growled. "Even if I have to fight against you and whatever you've summoned, I will find a way to stop this madness." His uncle's smile faded, replaced by a look of pity. "Then you are a fool," Tommy said quietly. "You will only meet despair and death if you continue down this path. The spirits will not show mercy, nor will I." The room fell into a heavy silence. Tom's heart hammered in his chest, his breathing ragged. He had gotten the truth, or at least as much of it as he could bear to hear. His uncle had become something monstrous, driven by his desire to wield forbidden power. The village was caught in the grip of a curse, and it was his uncle who held the key to breaking it. Tom turned to leave, his movements stiff and mechanical. He felt hollow, as if the darkness had reached out and scooped out a piece of his soul. At the doorway, he paused, looking back at the man who had once been his guardian. "I loved you," he said, his voice breaking, "but I will not let you destroy this place, even if it means going against you." His uncle did not respond. He merely watched as Tom stepped out of the room, the shadows swallowing him whole. As the door closed behind him, Tom felt the full weight of the task ahead. His uncle had unleashed a curse upon the village, a curse that would not be easily undone. But Tom was no longer a child, and he would not run from the darkness. If his uncle had invoked ancient powers, then he would find a way to confront them. No matter how terrified he was, outside the sky had darkened further, clouds gathering as if in anticipation of the storm to come. Tom looked up, his heart heavy with fear and determination. The final rite was approaching, and with it, the fate of the village. He had little time, and no idea how to stop what his uncle had set in motion. But one thing was certain: he would face whatever horrors awaited, even if it meant confronting the darkness within his own blood. And as he walked away from the house, a cold wind swept through the village, carrying with it the whispers of the spirits and the promise of a reckoning. Part 5. The Ritual. The sky had turned to a bruised purple as dusk settled over the village, shadows creeping out of every corner like silent predators. Tom stood by his window, watching as darkness fell like a shroud, blanketing the village in an eerie stillness. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, as if it held its breath in anticipation of something dreadful. Tom knew that tonight would be the night he would follow his uncle into the heart of the darkness and put an end to the horrors that plagued this land. For days he had wrestled with his fear, his uncertainty. What could he do against ancient magic and forces he could not understand? But he also knew he could not stand by any longer. His uncle had become a vessel for something evil, something that fed on the souls of the living. If he didn't act, more would die, this much he was certain. His uncle had been restless all day, moving about the house with a strange manic energy. Tom had watched him from the shadows, his heart pounding in his chest, waiting for the moment his uncle would slip out and begin whatever dark ceremony he had planned. And now, as night deepened, he felt it in his bones the ritual was about to begin. Tom slipped out of his room and crept to the hallway, careful not to make a sound. He crouched by the corner, eyes fixed on his uncle's door. The silence was deafening, broken only by the muffled creaks of the old house. Then the door creaked open, and his uncle emerged, clad in a dark cloak that billowed around him like a spectre. His face was obscured, but Tom could see the glint of his eyes, sharp and cold as a winter's night. Tom's breath hitched as he watched his uncle move toward the front door. With a soft click, his uncle unlatched it and stepped out into the night, disappearing into the shadows. This was it. Tom's heart pounded in his chest, his hands slick with sweat. He swallowed hard, steeling himself for what he was about to do. "You have to stop him," he thought, forcing his legs to move. He followed his uncle into the darkness, keeping a safe distance. The village lay in uneasy slumber, its windows shuttered, and doors barred as if it sensed the evil that roamed the streets. The only sound was the soft crunch of his uncle's boots against the forest path. Tom moved silently, his breath shallow, eyes straining to see through the shadows. The path twisted and turned, leading deeper into the woods, where the trees loomed like ancient sentinels, their branches twisting toward the sky in grotesque shapes. His uncle walked with purpose, never looking back. They went deeper into the forest than Tom had ever been before, the canopy above blocking out even the faintest glimmer of moonlight. It felt as though they had stepped into another world, a place where the natural laws no longer applied. Tom's skin prickled with uneasy. Darkness here was alive, a tangible force that pressed against him, whispering of things better left forgotten. After what felt like hours, his uncle finally stopped in a small clearing, a place that seemed untouched by time. The air was dense, filled with the stench of decay. The ground was littered with dead leaves, and in the center of the clearing lay a stone slab, weathered and stained with something dark. Tom felt bile rise in his throat as he recognized the slab for what it was: a sacrificial altar. His uncle moved to the altar, pulling something out from under his cloak. Tom squinted, his stomach lurching as he saw the object gleam in the faint light. It was a severed limb, wrapped in cloth stained a deep, sickening red. A human arm. Tom clamped a hand over his mouth to stifle the gasp that threatened to escape. His mind reeled with horror. What is he doing? Tom thought, his body trembling with fear. His uncle placed the limb on the stone slab, unwrapping it carefully as if handling a sacred relic. Then he pulled out a small knife, its blade edged with strange symbols that seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. Tom could barely breathe, every instinct screaming at him to run, to get away from this nightmare. But he couldn't. He had come here to stop this, and he had to see it through. The ritual began with a low, guttural chant. His uncle's voice was deep and harsh, the words foreign and twisted, as if dragged from the depths of the earth. The air grew colder with each syllable, the darkness thickening around them like a suffocating veil. Tom watched, his heart hammering in his chest, as his uncle raised the knife, holding it above the limb. The chanting grew louder, more fervent, echoing through the clearing like a dirge from the underworld. The ground beneath them began to tremble, a low rumble that vibrated through Tom's bones. The shadows around the clearing seemed to move, writhing like serpents, coiling closer with each passing moment. Tom's skin prickled with fear. This is real, he thought, panic clawing at his mind. The magic is real, his uncle continued chanting, his eyes rolling back into his head as if he were possessed by some otherworldly force. The knife gleamed in his hand, its tip hovering just above the severed limb. Tom felt a surge of terror. He had to act. If he didn't, something unspeakable would be unleashed upon the village. Summoning every ounce of courage he possessed, Tom stepped into the clearing. Stop, he shouted, his voice cracking with fear and rage. This ends now. His uncle's eyes snapped open, the chanting halting abruptly. For a moment, there was a silence so profound that Tom could hear his own heart pounding in his ears. Then his uncle turned to face him, a look of pure, unbridled fury twisting his features. You dare to interrupt the ritual, he hissed, his voice dripping with venom. You have no idea what you are meddling with. I know enough, Tom shot back, his hands shaking but his gaze steady. I know you've unleashed a curse on the village, and I know it has to stop. I won't let you continue this madness. His uncle's lips curled into a sneer. Foolish boy, he spat. You think you can stop what has already been set in motion? The power I am calling upon is far beyond your comprehension. Tom took a step forward, his muscles tensed, ready for the confrontation he knew was coming. I don't care how powerful you think it is, he said through gritted teeth. I care about the people in that village, the people you've condemned for your twisted desires. His uncle roared, his eyes blazing with an unnatural light. This is not about desire. This is about knowledge, about harnessing the ancient forces that shape our world. You speak of consequences, but you know nothing of the greater truth. As he spoke, the ground around the altar began to crack, thin lines of darkness spider-webbing outward, pulsing with a sickly energy. The air vibrated with a low hum, growing louder, more insistent, like the droning of a swarm of locusts. Tom felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up, a cold sweat breaking out across his skin. The ritual was reaching its climax, and if he didn't act now, it would be too late. With a burst of adrenaline, Tom lunged forward. His uncle snarled, raising the knife, but Tom was faster. He grabbed his uncle's wrist, the impact jarring up his arm as they struggled. The knife clattered to the ground, and for a brief moment Tom felt a surge of triumph. But his uncle's other hand shot out, gripping Tom's throat with a strength that belied his age. "You will not interfere," his uncle hissed, his voice a guttural growl that sent a wave of terror crashing over Tom. The grip tightened, and spots danced before Tom's eyes as he gasped for breath. Desperation clawed at him. He couldn't let it end like this. With the last of his strength, he reached for the knife. His fingers brushed the hilt, and he grasped it, driving it into the ground beside the altar. The impact broke the ritual circle, and a blinding light erupted from the stone slab. His uncle screamed, a sound of rage and agony that echoed through the woods. The ground buckled beneath them, and the shadows recoiled, writhing as they dissipated into the air. Tom fell back, gasping for breath as his uncle staggered, clutching at his head. The limb on the altar turned to ash, scattering in the wind. The darkness that had hung over the clearing dissipated, leaving behind an eerie silence. "It's over," Tom rasped, his chest heaving. "You can't control it anymore." His uncle collapsed to his knees, staring at the ashes with a mixture of horror and disbelief. No, he muttered, his voice cracking. "You ruined it. You ruined everything." Tom pushed himself to his feet, his body aching from the struggle. He approached his uncle cautiously, his heart pounding with fear and pity. "It was never yours to control," he said quietly. "You were meddling with forces that were never meant to be harnessed. Now it's done." His uncle looked up at him, his eyes hollow and filled with a grief that made Tom's heart twist. "You don't understand," he whispered, his voice breaking. "The spirits, they will not forgive this." Tom held his gaze, his own fear mirrored in his uncle's eyes. "Then we'll face them," he said firmly. "But not like this, not with blood and darkness." The clearing was still, the night air heavy with the aftermath of the ritual. As Tom stood there, he felt a strange calm settle over him. The battle was far from over, but tonight he had taken a stand against the darkness. And for now that was enough. Part 6. The struggle. The forest around them was alive with shadows, writhing like snakes in the dim moonlight that barely penetrated the canopy above. The air was thick with the stench of rot and decay, a choking odor that made Tom's stomach turn. His uncle stood in the middle of the clearing, his arms raised high as he chanted in a harsh, guttural language that made Tom's skin crawl. His voice cut through the night like a knife, each word echoing with a malevolent power that vibrated through the ground beneath Tom's feet. Tom watched, hidden behind a gnarled tree, his heart pounding so hard he was sure it would give him away. He had followed his uncle deep into the woods, pushing through his fear as he ventured further than ever before. Now, standing on the edge of the clearing, he witnessed the full extent of the horror his uncle had unleashed. A circle of strange symbols was drawn on the forest floor, glowing faintly with a sickly green light. At its center lay an altar, stained dark with what could only be blood. His uncle moved with a grim determination, his eyes glassy and vacant, as if he was not entirely in control of his own body. The ritual had begun, and Tom knew he had little time to act. His breath caught as he saw his uncle reach into the folds of his cloak and pull out a severed limb wrapped in a blood-stained cloth. The limb, human and grotesquely pale, gleamed in the dim light, and Tom felt a wave of nausea wash over him. His uncle held the limb aloft, his voice rising into a fevered pitch, the chanting growing louder and more frenzied. The air around them crackled with an unnatural energy, static prickling against Tom's skin. Tom knew he had to act, had to stop this before the dark magic could take hold completely. Summoning every ounce of courage, he stepped forward into the clearing, his voice breaking through his uncle's chant. "Stop," he shouted, his voice raw with fear and fury. "Uncle, this madness ends now." For a moment everything froze. His uncle's chanting ceased, his eyes snapping open to reveal a terrible emptiness within them. He turned slowly to face Tom, and in that instant, Tom felt a chill that pierced him to his very core. His uncle's face was twisted into a mask of rage and something far more terrifying and inhuman, malevolent force that glowed behind his eyes like dark fire. "You dare interrupt," his uncle snarled, his voice a guttural growl that was not entirely his own. It was deeper, layered with an echo that seemed to vibrate through the very earth around them. "You are a fool, Tom. You do not understand the power at work here. I don't need to understand it," Tom spat back, his hands trembling as he stood his ground. "I just know it's evil. Look at what it's done to you. You're not yourself, you're being controlled by it." His uncle laughed, a harsh, mocking sound that sent shivers down Tom's spine. Controlled, he hissed, his eyes blazing. I have become one with it. This power is mine to wield, and you are nothing but an insect standing in its path. With a sudden, unnatural speed, his uncle lunged forward, closing the distance between them in an instant. Tom barely had time to react before he felt his uncle's hands around his throat, squeezing with a strength that was far beyond human. Tom gasped, his vision blurring as pain exploded in his neck. Submit, his uncle roared, his face inches from Tom's, his breath hot and reeking of decay. Kneel before the darkness and you may yet be spared. Tom clawed at his uncle's hands, panic surging through him. His uncle's grip was unbreakable like iron shackles around his neck. Spots danced before his eyes, his lungs burning for air. No, he couldn't give up, couldn't let the darkness win. With a desperate surge of adrenaline, Tom brought his knee up hard into his uncle's stomach. His uncle grunted, the impact forcing him to release his grip. Tom staggered back, gasping for breath, his hands clutching at his bruised throat. The forest around them seemed to close in, the trees whispering with voices that clawed at his sanity. His uncle straightened, eyes blazing with fury. His movements were jerky, unnatural, as if something inside him was pulling the strings of a puppet. You cannot stop this, his uncle snarled, his voice laced with the power of whatever dark force had possessed him. You are nothing compared to the might of the ancient spirits. Tom steadied himself, his legs trembling but his resolve hardening. I don't care how ancient or powerful it is, he growled. You're still my uncle and I won't let you destroy yourself or this village with a roar. His uncle charged again, his hands raised to strike. Tom dodged to the side, narrowly avoiding a blow that would have shattered bone. His uncle's strength was terrifying, every move infused with the unnatural power of the ritual. Tom felt a surge of fear, the realization hitting him hard. He was not just fighting his uncle, he was battling the darkness that controlled him. The struggle became a frantic dance of movement and chaos. Tom ducked and weaved, his heart racing as he dodged strike after strike. His uncle's eyes glowed with a sickly green light, his face contorted with rage and something inhuman. Tom could hear the chanting of ancient voices in the air, a discordant chorus that filled his mind with whispers of despair. His uncle lashed out with a backhanded blow that caught Tom across the cheek, sending him sprawling to the ground. Pain exploded across his face, and for a moment he lay there, dazed, the world spinning around him. His uncle loomed over him, raising his hands high, and in them, Tom saw the glint of the ritual knife, its blade gleaming with a malevolent light. No, Tom gasped, struggling to get to his feet. I won't let you. As his uncle brought the knife down, Tom twisted to the side, narrowly avoiding the blade that sank into the earth where his head had been. Seizing his chance, Tom grabbed his uncle's wrist, twisting it with all the strength he could muster. His uncle cried out, the knife clattered into the ground as his grip weakened. Tom wrestled him to the ground, the two of them grappling in the dirt. His uncle's strength was monstrous, every muscle driven by the dark force within him. Tom felt his own strength waning, his arms burning from the effort of holding his uncle down. Sweat dripped into his eyes, blurring his vision, but he gritted his teeth, refusing to let go. Listen to me, Tom shouted, his voice strained as he struggled to keep his uncle pinned. This power is using you, it's feeding on you, twisting you into something you're not. His uncle's face twisted into a sneer, his lips curling back to reveal teeth stained with blood. You are a fool, he spat, his eyes gleaming with that sickly green light. The power is mine to command. It obeys me, no, Tom growled, his muscles screaming in protest as he fought to keep his uncle down. It's destroying you. It's not obeying you, it's controlling you, consuming everything you are for a moment. Something flickered in his uncle's eyes, a brief glimmer of recognition of the man he once was. But then, the darkness surged back, his eyes glazing over as he let out a guttural snarl, twisting violently beneath Tom. The force of the movement sent them both rolling across the ground, tumbling in a mess of limbs and dirt. Tom gasped as his uncle's fist connected with his ribs, pain lancing through his side. He choked back a cry, his vision dimming at the edges. No, he couldn't let this be the end. The village, the people depended on him to end this nightmare. Summoning the last of his strength, he reached out and grasped the knife where it had fallen. With a primal scream, Tom drove the blade into the ground beside them, severing the ritual circle that glowed faintly on the forest floor. The effect was immediate. The air around them exploded with a deafening roar, a shock wave of energy that knocked them both back. His uncle screamed, his body convulsing as the green light in his eyes flickered and dimmed. Tom struggled to his knees, gasping for breath, his whole body trembling from the effort. His uncle lay on the ground, twitching, the darkness that had possessed him seeping out in tendrils of black smoke. The forest around them seemed to breathe, the tension in the air easing as the malevolent energy dissipated. "It's over," Tom panted, his voice hoarse. He crawled toward his uncle, who lay motionless on the ground. "Uncle," slowly, his uncle opened his eyes. They were no longer glowing, no longer filled with that terrible light. They were just human, tired, haunted, and filled with the weight of what he had done. Tommy croaked, his voice barely a whisper. "What have I done?" Tom sat back, his chest heaving as he fought to catch his breath. "You were consumed by it," he replied quietly. "But it's over now. You're here." The darkness is gone. His uncle's eyes fluttered shut for a moment, his chest rising and falling with labored breaths. Tom watched him, his own heart heavy. There was relief in having stopped the ritual, but there was also a deep sadness. This man lying before him was his uncle, the one who had raised him, taught him so much, and yet he had become a vessel for something dark and destructive. Tom struggled to his feet, every muscle in his body screaming in protest. His clothes were torn, his skin bruised and caked with dirt. He swayed, feeling the exhaustion settle into his bones, but he forced himself to stand tall. This wasn't over, not yet. The power his uncle had invoked was ancient and dangerous, and though the ritual had been disrupted, Tom could sense that the darkness still lingered, waiting for an opportunity to claw its way back. Tommy's uncle's voice was faint, and Tom dropped to his knees beside him. His uncle's eyes were open now, dull and filled with regret. "I'm sorry," gasped, his words thick with pain. "I thought I could control it." Tom nodded, his throat tightening. "I know," he replied, his voice rough. "You thought you could use the power for something greater, but it was using you instead." His uncle shuddered, a pained expression twisting his face. "It whispered to me," he continued, his gaze distant, as if he were reliving the moments of his dark descent. "It promised power, knowledge. I was a fool." Tom clenched his jaw, his eyes burning. "You weren't just a fool," he said, his voice hard. "You were blinded by greed and ambition. You unleashed a curse upon this village, our home, and people have suffered for it." A tear slid down his uncle's cheek, glistening in the dim light of the forest. "I know," he whispered, his voice breaking. "And now, it's too late." "No," Tom insisted, leaning closer. "It's not too late. We stopped the ritual. The darkness is gone, but we have to make things right. We have to face the consequences and help the village heal." His uncle's eyes closed, his body going limp as he let out a shaky breath. For a moment, Tom feared the worst, that his uncle had finally succumbed to the dark power that had been coursing through him. But then he heard a soft, ragged breath, and he knew his uncle was still alive, still clinging to the last threads of life. Tom sat back on his heels, looking up at the sky through the tangled branches overhead. The forest was eerily quiet, as if holding its breath after the violent struggle. The tension that had filled the air earlier had dissipated, leaving behind an almost peaceful stillness. But Tom knew that the true battle was far from over. He glanced down at the knife still embedded in the ground beside the disrupted ritual circle. Its blade, etched with the strange symbols of his uncle's dark magic, no longer glowed with that sinister light. Instead, it lay dull and lifeless, a mere relic of the horror that had nearly been unleashed. Tom reached out, his hand trembling as he grasped the hilt. He pulled the knife free from the earth, holding it up before his eyes. This blade had been the instrument of his uncle's madness, the key to the dark power that had nearly consumed them both. Tom felt a shudder run through him as he looked at it, a mix of revulsion and grim determination. "This ends here," he muttered to himself, his grip tightening around the knife. No more darkness, no more rituals. With that, he turned toward the altar in the center of the clearing. His uncle's ritual had tainted this place, but Tom was determined to cleanse it. He raised the knife high, then drove it into the altar with all his strength. The stone cracked with a deafening noise, fissures spreading out from the point of impact like spiderwebs. A gust of wind erupted from the altar, swirling around Tom in a fierce, chaotic whirlwind. Tom stumbled back, shielding his eyes as the wind howled through the trees, carrying with it a cacophony of whispers, ghostly voices crying out in pain, in anger, in sorrow. The wind grew stronger, swirling faster until it reached a fever pitch, and then, suddenly, it ceased. The forest fell silent once more, the echoes of the ritual fading into nothingness. Tom opened his eyes, lowering his arm. The altar was split in two, its power broken. He felt a strange sense of calm wash over him, as if the forest itself had released a long-held breath. He turned back to his uncle, who lay motionless on the ground, his face pale and drawn. "It's over," Tom said quietly, more to himself than to his uncle. "The darkness is gone," his uncle groaned softly, his eyes fluttering open. He looked up at Tom, a mixture of pain and relief on his face. "You did it," he croaked. "You stopped it," Tom nodded, feeling a weight lift from his chest. "Yes, but there's still so much to fix," he replied. "The village, the people, they need to know the truth. They need to see that the darkness is gone." His uncle closed his eyes, his expression pained. "They won't forgive me," he muttered. "And I don't expect them to." Tom stood there, his heart aching. His uncle was right. The village would not easily forgive, nor should they. What his uncle had done was unforgivable, and the scars would linger for a long time. But they had to start somewhere. They had to begin the process of healing, of reclaiming what the darkness had stolen. "Then we face it together," Tom said firmly, determination hardening in his voice. "You will face what you've done, and I will help the village recover. We'll make things right as best we can." His uncle's eyes opened, staring up at him with a mixture of sadness and gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "For not giving up on me." Tom took a deep breath, the enormity of the struggle they had just survived settling over him. He reached down, pulling his uncle to his feet, supporting his weight as they began the slow walk back to the village. The path through the forest was dark and winding, but Tom felt a faint glimmer of hope. The darkness had been defeated, at least for now, and they had a chance to rebuild. As they walked, Tom glanced at his uncle, who stumbled beside him, weakened but alive. There was still so much to confront, so much pain to endure. But Tom was ready to face it. They had survived the struggle against the darkness, and now they would face the consequences and seek redemption. The forest around them rustled softly, the wind whispering through the leaves. It was a different sound now, no longer filled with the menacing murmurs of the dark power that had threatened to consume them. It was just the forest, quiet and still, as if acknowledging the end of the terrible ritual. Tom tightened his grip on his uncle's arm as they emerged from the woods, the village coming into view through the trees. The houses stood silent, their inhabitants asleep, unaware of the battle that had just taken place deep in the forest. But soon they would know. Soon the village would learn of the darkness that had almost overtaken them and the struggle that had saved them. One step at a time, Tom whispered to himself as they approached the village. "We will face the darkness and we will find the light again." With that thought, he pushed forward, guiding his uncle back toward the village they both called home, ready to begin the long, painful journey toward healing and redemption. Part 7. The Apparition. The air crackled with a tense, electric energy as Tom supported his uncle back to his feet, both of them exhausted from their harrowing struggle. His uncle's breath came in ragged gasps, his eyes glassy and distant, as if some part of him was still lost in the darkness they had just battled. Tom's own body ached, every muscle strained to the breaking point, but the adrenaline surging through him pushed the pain aside. He had to finish this. Suddenly the air grew cold. A biting, unnatural chill swept through the clearing, cutting through the dense forest air like a knife. Tom felt his skin prickle, goosebumps spreading across his arms as an icy dread settled in his gut. He knew without needing to see that something was here with them. Something old, something filled with malice. "Do you feel that?" he whispered, his voice trembling. His uncle didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the shattered remnants of the altar, eyes wide and unfocused. A low guttural howl rose from the edge of the clearing, sending a shiver of terror down Tom's spine. He turned, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. From the darkness beyond the trees, a shape began to form, swirling like a mist, its edges coiling and twisting. The fog solidified, taking on a humanoid shape, tall and impossibly thin, draped in tattered, ghostly rags that fluttered in a wind only it could feel. Its face, or what should have been a face, was nothing but a black void, a gaping abyss that seemed to pull at the very fabric of reality. The howl turned into a wailing screech, a sound that clawed at Tom's sanity, filling his head with whispers of agony and despair. His knees almost buckled as a wave of nausea and fear crashed over him. The spectre moved toward them, its form gliding just above the ground, leaving a trail of darkness in its wake. Its presence was suffocating, like a dense fog wrapping around Tom's mind, and squeezing out all hope. In its hands, or what resembled hands, was a dark, pulsating mass, writhing with an unnatural light. Tom recognized it immediately. It was the relic, the heart of the ritual. "Uncle! Get up," Tom shouted, his voice cracking as he pulled his uncle back. But his uncle remained frozen, his eyes locked on the advancing figure. His face was a mask of sheer terror, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly, as if he were trying to scream but couldn't find his voice. The spectre stopped a few feet away, its void-like face turning toward Tom, though it had no eyes. Yet Tom could feel its gaze burning into him, a searing pressure that bore down on his soul. It raised the relic high, the dark mass pulsing with a sickening light that bathed the clearing in a ghastly glow. The relic seemed to throb with life, drawing in the shadows around it like a vortex. No, Tom breathed, his heart racing. He had to do something, anything. He couldn't let this monstrosity complete whatever dark purpose it had. As the spectre loomed over them, Tom felt a strange stillness wash over him. It was as if time itself had slowed, the sounds of the forest fading into a muted hum. He looked at his uncle, who had collapsed to his knees, paralyzed with fear. His uncle's eyes were wide, staring at the relic in the apparition's grasp as if it held the power to strip away his very soul. His uncle's voice was a raspy whisper, barely audible. "It wants the relic. It's coming for me." Tom felt a surge of anger and fear twist together inside him. This creature was here to claim his uncle. The realization hit him like a cold slap to the face. The relic was the key. If he could just get it out of the spectre's grasp, he might be able to stop this madness once and for all. Summoning every ounce of courage he had, Tom lunged forward. The spectre screeched, an ear-piercing wail that rattled his bones, but he ignored it, his focus locked on the relic. His hand shot out, grabbing the relic from the spectre's grasp. The moment his fingers touched it, a jolt of freezing energy surged through his arm, burning him from the inside out. He cried out in pain, his body trembling, but he held on, wrenching the relic free with a desperate, furious yank. The spectre howled, a sound of rage and hunger that vibrated through the clearing. It recoiled, its form twisting and writhing as if in agony, the darkness around it swirling violently. Tom stumbled back, the relic clutched in his hand, its surface cold and slick like the skin of a dead thing. "Destroy it," his uncle croaked, his voice strained and frantic. "Throw it into the fire." Tom's head whipped around, his eyes landing on the small fire that had been part of the ritual. The flames flickered weakly, casting long shadows that danced around the clearing. Without thinking, he spun on his heel, raising the relic high above his head. The spectre lunged, its bony arms outstretched, fingers twisted into claws. It moved faster than Tom could have imagined, its form elongating and stretching toward him like a nightmare made real. Tom's heart nearly stopped. He had seconds, no, less than that. With a primal scream, Tom hurled the relic into the fire. For a split second, everything went still. The spectre froze in mid-lunge, its body contorting, the darkness around it pulsing violently. The relic hit the flames, and there was an explosive burst of light that filled the clearing, so blinding that Tom threw his arms over his face, stumbling back. A sound like the roar of a hurricane filled the air, a deafening cacophony that shook the ground. The fire blazed with a furious intensity, the flames turning from orange to a sickly green, and then to white hot. The relic writhed in the flames, its surface bubbling and hissing as the fire consumed it. The spectre screamed, a wail of utter despair and rage that echoed through the forest. It writhed, its form unraveling, the darkness peeling away like smoke caught in a whirlwind. The shadows that had gathered around it dissipated, scattering into the night. For a brief moment, Tom glimpsed what lay beneath the faint outline of a twisted, anguished face before it dissolved into nothingness. The light from the fire surged, a final burst that forced Tom to shield his eyes. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the light faded and the forest fell into an eerie silence. The fire crackled softly, its flames now a warm, golden hue. Tom lowered his arms, blinking rapidly to clear the spots from his vision. The spectre was gone. Tom stumbled forward, his legs weak, his mind reeling. He stared into the fire where the relic had been, now nothing more than ashes swirling in the gentle breeze. The sense of malevolence that had filled the clearing was gone, replaced by an almost peaceful stillness. Tommy's uncle's voice broke through the silence, ragged and strained. Tom turned, his chest heaving as he looked at the man who lay crumpled on the ground. His uncle's face was pale, his eyes hollow, But there was something different now. The madness that had gripped him was gone, leaving only the broken shell of the man he once was. "It's over," Tom panted, falling to his knees beside his uncle. "The relic is destroyed. The darkness, it's gone." His uncle stared at the fire, his eyes wet with unshed tears. I felt it," he whispered, his voice filled with both horror and relief. "It was pulling me in, I thought I was lost." Tom placed a hand on his uncle's shoulder, squeezing it tightly. "You're not lost," he said, his voice firm despite the tremor that ran through it. "We stopped it." Together, a weak smile flickered on his uncle's lips, his eyes closing as he let out a shuddering breath. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice trailing off into the quiet of the forest. Tom sat back, his own body trembling from the ordeal. He glanced around the clearing, at the shattered altar, the dissipating mist of shadows, and the fire that still burned gently in the center. It was over. The relic, the source of the darkness, was gone, and with it, the hold it had on his uncle and the village. He looked up at the sky, where the clouds had begun to part, revealing a sliver of the moon. Its pale light bathed the forest in a soft glow, dispelling the lingering shadows. Tom took a deep breath, feeling the tension in his chest finally release. It was over. They had survived. Yet, as Tom sat there in the clearing, he knew that this victory came at a cost. The darkness had left its mark on them, scars that would take a long time to heal. But for now they had banished the apparition, destroyed the cursed relic, and reclaimed their lives from the grip of an ancient evil. Tom closed his eyes, exhaustion washing over him. "We'll rebuild," he whispered, his voice lost in the night. One day at a time, and as the first light of dawn began to creep through the trees, Tom and his uncle lay there, survivors of a nightmare that had finally been laid to rest. Part 8. The curse breaks. The fire roared with an intensity that seemed to defy nature, its flames consuming the cursed relic with a voracious hunger. As the relic burned, an acrid stench filled the air, a nauseating mix of decay and something far more ancient, something that reeked of centuries of suffering. Tom staggered back, his eyes fixed on the flames as they danced wildly, casting grotesque shadows across the clearing. The ground beneath his feet began to tremble, a deep, resonant vibration that shook him to his core. It was as if the very earth was rebelling against the dark magic being destroyed. Tom felt the tremors climb up his legs, rattling his bones. The relic, now engulfed in the heart of the fire, pulsed with a malevolent energy, its surface bubbling and hissing as it was consumed. He could hear it, faint but unmistakable, the distant wails and whispers of spirits trapped within, their cries of agony echoing through the clearing. A gust of wind whipped through the trees, cold and biting, howling like a chorus of lost souls. It spiraled around Tom, tearing at his clothes and hair, sending chills racing down his spine. He gritted his teeth, his eyes watering against the force of the wind as it howled louder, drowning out every other sound. The air was thick with power, ancient and wrathful, swirling around the clearing like a storm ready to break. Tom looked toward his uncle, who was standing at the edge of the clearing, his face twisted in an expression of horror. His eyes were wide, locked onto the relic burning in the flames, reflecting the chaotic dance of light and shadow. His uncle's mouth moved, but no words came out. His voice seemed to have been stolen by the wind. He staggered forward a step, reaching out as if to grasp something just beyond his reach. "No," his uncle finally screamed, his voice raw and filled with anguish. "No, you don't understand." But it was too late. The relic cracked, a spider web of fractures spreading across its surface as the flames consumed it. With each crack, a burst of dark energy shot out, riding tendrils of smoke and shadow that twisted and writhed the air. The ground shuddered violently, as if the earth itself was tearing apart at the seams. Tom braced himself, his heart pounding in his chest, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. Then, from deep within the fire, there was a deafening boom, a shock wave of power that blasted outward in all directions. Tom was thrown to the ground, the impact knocking the breath from his lungs. For a moment, everything went dark, the world around him reduced to a void of swirling shadows and roaring wind. When he opened his eyes, he saw it, the curse. It was rising from the fire like a serpent uncoiling from the depths, a mass of swirling darkness that pulsed and writhed. It took on a shape not quite human, more like a twisted, nightmarish amalgamation of limbs and faces. Its form twisted and contorted, shifting between the shadows as if it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. Its presence filled the clearing, oppressive and suffocating, exuding a power so dark that it made Tom's blood run cold. The curse loomed above them, writhing in the air, its many faces turning toward Tom and his uncle. It hissed, a sound that sent a bolt of terror straight through Tom's heart. It was as if the darkness itself had come alive, furious at being forced from its hold over the relic. For a heartbeat, Tom thought it would lash out, that it would engulf them both and drag them into the abyss. But then the fire flared up, blazing so brightly that it painted the entire clearing in a brilliant white light. The curse shrieked, a high-pitched wail of pain and fury. It convulsed, its form collapsing in on itself, writhing and shrinking as if the light was burning it away. The ground beneath it cracked open, a fissure forming in the earth that began to draw the darkness downward, swallowing it whole. The curse screamed again, a final, ear-piercing cry that made Tom clap his hands over his ears. The wind howled, circling the clearing in a frenzied spiral, and then, all at once, it stopped. The curse was dragged into the fissure, the ground sealing shut with a deafening crack. Silence fell over the forest, the air still and heavy, as if the entire world had been holding its breath. Tom lay there on the ground, his chest heaving as he gulped down air. His body ached from the struggle, his head pounding from the cacophony of the curse's final wail. He pushed himself up onto his elbows, blinking against the blinding spots dancing in his vision. The fire had died down, reduced to a smoldering pile of embers in the center of the clearing. The relic was gone, nothing left but ash and soup. And then he saw his uncle. The man was crumpled on the ground, his body trembling, as if caught in the throes of a violent fever. His once strong frame looked frail, shrunken, like a husk drained of life. Tom crawled toward him, his heart hammering in his chest. "Uncle," he shouted, his voice cracking with fear. "Uncle, are you all right?" His uncle slowly turned his head, his eyes sunken and hollow. They were no longer glowing with the sickly light of the curse, but instead were filled with a haunting emptiness, the look of a man who had stared into the abyss and been shattered by it. His lips moved, his voice a rasp, barely audible. "Tom, what have I done?" Tom's heart clenched at the sight of his uncle, reduced to this broken shell of a man. "It's over," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "The curse, it's broken. The darkness is gone." His uncle's eyes fluttered closed, his body sagging as if a great weight had finally been lifted from him. "Gone," he breathed, his voice thin and wavering, "but it has left." Its mark Tom knelt beside his uncle, his own body trembling with the aftermath of the ordeal. The clearing was eerie quiet, the forest around them still and watchful, as if waiting to see what would happen next. He placed a hand on his uncle's shoulder, feeling the thinness of his frame, the fragility that had not been there before. Uncle Tom said softly, his throat tight with grief, We stopped it. We saved the village." "But it's not over for us, is it?" His uncle opened his eyes, gazing up at the canopy of trees overhead. "No," he murmured, his voice carrying the weight of regret. "The darkness, it leaves scars. It takes something from you, even when it goes." Tom looked around the clearing, at the broken remnants of the altar, the charred ground where the relic had burned. The air felt lighter, the oppressive presence of the curse gone, but he could feel the truth in his uncle's words. They had broken the curse, but the shadow of what had happened would linger both on the village and on them. The ground beneath them had stopped trembling. The wind had died down, but a part of the forest still felt unsettled, as if the earth itself was remembering the darkness that had passed through it. Tom looked down at his hands, dirt and ash smeared across his skin, and felt the weight of what they had just endured settle on his shoulders. "We'll live with it," he said, his voice steadying as he looked back at his uncle. "We'll bear the scars and we'll move forward. The curse is broken, and that's what matters." His uncle nodded weakly, closing his eyes again. "Yes, but we must never forget," he whispered. "It can come back. If we forget..." Tom nodded, understanding the gravity of his uncle's words. The darkness had been defeated, but it was not destroyed. It was a reminder that the evils they had faced were ever present, lurking on the edges of the world, waiting for a moment of weakness to creep back in. With a deep breath, Tom stood, his legs unsteady but his resolve firm. He turned his gaze to the horizon, where the first light of dawn was beginning to break through the trees. It painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, a stark contrast to the darkness they had just faced. In the light of the new day, the forest seemed to sigh, releasing its tension as if acknowledging the end of the long, grim night. We'll rebuild, he said quietly, as much to himself as to his uncle. We'll help the village heal. And we'll remember. He reached down, helping his uncle to his feet. The man swayed, leaning heavily on Tom's shoulder. Together, they began the slow, weary walk back toward the village, leaving the clearing behind them. As they moved, Tom glanced back one last time, his eyes lingering on the smoldering fire and the fractured ground where the curse had vanished. The battle was over. The curse was broken. But the darkness had left its mark, a scar on the land, on their souls, and on the hearts of those who would carry this memory forward. And they would carry it always as a warning and a testament to the strength it took to confront the horrors within and without. The wind stirred again, gentler this time, rustling the leaves in a soft murmur, as if whispering secrets to the trees. Tom listened to it as they walked, his heart heavy, but his spirit unbroken. They had survived. They had fought the darkness and won, but they would never be the same. And that, he realized, was the price of breaking the curse. Part 9. Aftermath and Reflection. The village lay still, bathed in the soft glow of the morning light. The fog that had clung to its streets for what seemed like ages had lifted, leaving behind a fresh, dew-kissed landscape. Birds chirped hesitantly in the trees, as if testing the air for the lingering traces of the darkness that had once held the village in its grip. Life was slowly returning to normal, but an unspoken tension lingered, like the faint echo of a scream in a quiet room. Tom walked through the village, feeling the weight of the silence that surrounded him. Though the curse had been broken, its shadow still hung over the place, creeping into the corners of homes and the edges of every whispered conversation. Villagers had emerged from their homes, eyes red and swollen from nights spent in fear, searching for signs that the nightmare was truly over. They glanced at Tom with a mix of reverence and weariness. He had faced the darkness and survived, but they could sense the change in him, the mark that such a confrontation had left on his soul. He approached his uncle's house, now a hollow shell of what it once was. The windows stared blankly out into the village, the curtains drawn as if trying to shut out the world. Tom hesitated at the door, his hand resting on the worn wood. This house had once been filled with laughter, warmth, and a sense of belonging. Now it was a monument to the horrors they had faced, a grim reminder of the darkness that had nearly consumed them all. Taking a deep breath, Tom pushed the door open. Inside, the air was cool and stale, heavy with the scent of old wood and dust. His uncle sat in the far corner, hunched over in a chair by the cold hearth, staring into the empty grate. The man who had once been strong, proud, and full of life was now a ghost of his former self, a frail figure haunted by the memories of what he had unleashed. Uncle Tom called softly, stepping into the room. The floorboards creaked under his weight, the sound breaking the oppressive quiet. His uncle didn't respond, didn't even flinch. His eyes were locked on the hearth, his hands resting limply in his lap. Tom moved closer, his heart tightening at the sight. This man who had raised him, who had been a pillar of strength, was now broken, not by the supernatural forces they had battled, but by his own regret, his own guilt. Tom knelt beside him, placing a hand on his uncle's shoulder. "It's over," he said gently, though the words felt hollow. "The curse is gone." His uncle's gaze slowly shifted to Tom, his eyes sunken and dull. "Gone," he muttered, his voice raspy and weak. But not. Forgotten, his eyes seemed to drift past Tom, lost in a void of his own making. "I can still feel it. Lingering. It took something from me, Tom. Something I can't ever get back." Tom nodded, his jaw tightening as he forced himself to hold back the surge of emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. "It took from all of us," he replied quietly. "But we survived. The village survived. And we have to rebuild." "You have to rebuild?" A bitter smile twisted his uncle's lips, a faint glimmer of his old self flickering through the mask of sorrow. "Rebuild," he echoed, a touch of irony in his tone. "How do you rebuild a soul, Tom? How do you cut back together the pieces after you've let the darkness in?" Tom had no answer. He knew his uncle was right. The curse had broken more than just the village, it had shattered their lives, leaving cracks that would never fully heal. But they had to try. They had to move forward, even if it meant living with the shadows of the past. As the days passed, the village began to stir back to life. Fields were tilled, market stalls reopened, and children ventured outside, their laughter timid at first but gradually growing bolder. The villagers worked together, restoring what had been damaged, mending not just their homes but their spirits. Yet, Amidst the bustle of rebuilding, the memory of the darkness lingered. Every time they passed the clearing in the woods where the final struggle had taken place, they fell silent, casting furtive glances at the scorched earth. It was as if the land itself bore witness to the battle, the remnants of the ritual etched into the soil like scars. They avoided speaking of it directly, but everyone knew that the story of what happened there would be passed down, a cautionary tale to keep the future generations from repeating the mistakes of the past. Tom watched over the village, taking on the role of its silent guardian. His experience with the supernatural had changed him, hardening his resolve and sharpening his instincts. He patrolled the outskirts, his eyes scanning the forest edge for any sign of the darkness's return. He knew the curse was broken, but he also knew that evil had a way of creeping back, especially when people grew complacent. The villagers began to look to him for guidance, their trust in him born not from his strength, but from his scars. He had faced the darkness and emerged not unscared, but unbroken. That gave them hope. They sought his counsel, his protection, and though Tom felt unworthy of the role thrust upon him, he accepted it. He had no choice. The tale of his battle with the supernatural spread through the village like wildfire, each retelling more vivid and terrifying than the last. Children whispered it to one another at night, wide-eyed and shivering beneath their blankets. Elders spoke of it in hushed tones around the hearth, warning the young to never meddle with forces beyond their understanding. The story became legend, a part of the village's lore, casting a long shadow that would stretch across the generations. Tom's uncle, however, was a different story. He remained in his house, a prisoner of his own mind. The villagers avoided him, not out of malice, but out of fear. They saw in him a man who had brushed too close to the abyss and had been forever marked by it. They pitied him, but they also feared what he represented, the danger of ambition unchecked, of curiosity taken too far. Tom visited him every day, bringing food, speaking with him even when his uncle refused to respond. It was a ritual of sorts, a way for Tom to remind both himself and his uncle that they were still alive, that they could still find some measure of redemption in the life they had left. You don't have to live in darkness, Tom would say each time, his voice steady, though he was never sure if his uncle was truly listening. You can still choose to come back to the light. His uncle would simply nod or mutter something incoherent, his gaze fixed on something only he could see. The darkness had left him, but its shadow remained, a stain on his soul that refused to fade. Seasons changed, and the village flourished once more. Crops grew tall in the fields, and the marketplace bustled with life. Yet, the tale of Tom's encounter with the dark forces never died. It became a story told to children as a warning, a lesson that the village had learned through blood, and fearsome powers are not meant to be touched. Tom too bore the weight of that lesson. His days were filled with work and vigilance, but his nights were haunted by the memories of the curse, of the struggle in the clearing, and of his uncle's anguished cries. He knew that the darkness was part of him now, a scar that would remain even as he strove to be the village's protector. The villagers called him the guardian, a title that felt both a burden and a blessing. It was a reminder that he had survived the darkness and a warning of what could return if they ever grew careless. He embraced the role, understanding that it was his penance, his way of atoning for what his uncle had unleashed. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the village, Tom stood at the edge of the forest. The trees whispered in the breeze, their leaves rustling softly, and for a moment he thought he heard a faint echo of that terrible wail from the clearing. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath, grounding himself in the present. The curse had been broken. The village had been saved. But the shadow it left behind was a constant reminder of the price they had paid. As he turned to walk back toward the village, the last light of day fading into twilight, Tom knew one thing for certain: the darkness could return if they allowed it. It was his duty to ensure that it never did. His uncle would remain a shell of the man he once was, haunted by his own actions. The village would heal, but they would never forget. And Tom would be their guardian, standing as a living testament to the battle between light and dark, hope and despair. The village had survived, and so had he, but they were forever changed, marked by the shadows of what had transpired. And as the stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, Tom whispered a silent vow to himself and to the village never again. And so, the tale of the cursed village and its guardian became legend, casting its shadow over the hearts of all who called this place home, a warning, a reminder and a testament to the courage it took to face the darkness within and beyond.